I think there's been a big shift towards making that allocation, deallocation, reallocation part of an automation lifecycle process rather than being a relatively static thing where there's an operations team who do that balancing of resource on a weekly or monthly basis, shifting towards this idea of having a larger pool of resource that is dynamically carved up as resource requirements change. And this is no longer the operations team changing their resource requirements, it's more CI/CD pipelines leading to changes in applications being deployed out. Changes in the application configuration may then drive a change in the resource requirements. Maybe there's an optimization where we're going to use less RAM. That would be a great optimization tool at the moment as a trade-off to using more CPU time or maybe using a GPU to do some functions that would have otherwise done. Those kinds of dynamic changes is where we're going beyond simply pooling and sharing of resources with virtual machines to much more dynamic allocation and deallocation of resources.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's not just the CI/CD approach to it, but it's also the concept that there are ephemeral agents that run that will get spun up and run for a very brief time and get destroyed, and you need somewhere that you have the resources to actually run these things.
So, as you mentioned, Andy, about agents and the ephemeral nature, it's almost like they're living their best life in a world of what was, I think, serverless and microservices, right, approaches that were coming up during cloud proliferation, if you will. And I'm kind of wondering, too, as I think about this a little bit, too, that development teams at the end of the day just want resources, and they're not in the business of necessarily specifying things so much. Like at this point in this time, especially agents too, the agentic workflow is not saying, I need a compute of this particular size, right? It needs API endpoints and MCP servers hosted someplace where it's all software. It's all, right? It's all east-west and well, not always, but, amongst themselves, if they're conversing amongst themselves, right? If there's a swarm or pool of agents, those agents have no idea what the heck they're running on top of. And so if your infrastructure can reveal that in a way that makes sense for the folks who actually do care about that, so it's not this black box on top of a black box, I think there's real value there.
You want to hear an interesting fact? As you were talking about dynamic allocation, my mind went to time sharings, and not time sharing like apartments, like time sharing like mainframes. And if you remember a time before mainframes were time shared, you basically had exactly the same problem as you do with GPUs nowadays, right? You got this massive unit, and CFOs were absolutely not for it because it was an insane amount of cost, and you'd rarely actually use it at capacity unless you really, really were good at allocating. The whole bare metal, the whole allocating one whole GPU or multiples to the team that screams loudest, which I've seen with numerous customers, especially as this, ML thing was emerging a few years ago. They had a dedicated thing. Nobody knew how it ran. You paid for it and so on. It's really, you're going all the way back to 1965 and you're not getting the lesson that you were supposed to learn there, which is you want to go to that concept of time sharing, time slicing, and best utilization for all the things that are happening in your environment. So get to that point of not who screams the loudest, but the best partitioning of your resources based on what's going on. And that can only happen if you start slicing things in software, because dynamic allocation at the hardware level, again, a little bit of software is needed to get there.